Welcome back to a new edition of the Derek Evans Show, where we talk about the Shinsei method and other topics relevant to you, to your business, to your work, to your family, to your life. What is teamwork? In this segment, I want to talk about a concept and an idea and really an activity and a practice that a lot of people talk about. You hear it in a lot of leadership training programs, you hear it at the workplace a lot, particularly if they're doing training programs at the workplace. A lot of sports teams talk about it. You hear it a lot in the media. But unfortunately, like a lot of very important concepts, and I often talk about things like platitudes, which you can find some of the previous segments at the Shinsei Method YouTube channel, as well as the shinseimethod.com, where I talk about the wisdom behind platitudes and the approach that I take on this show and at the shinseimethod.com. What I like to do is go behind the platitudes to get at the wisdom that might exist, and the wisdom behind some of these important concepts that you often hear. Because what I found is, number one, not a lot of people think about them in practical terms to find out what they actually mean, so that you can understand how you can apply them in your everyday life, and then you can actually evaluate the results that you get. Because, of course, if you apply a particular concept, if you have a particular attitude, a pattern of thinking, that's going to translate into some kind of action. You're going to do something about it, usually, even if you consciously and conscientiously take an action to do something and to make a positive change. By the way, this is what is often called change management in practical terms. It's another important concept that you often hear, but again, not a lot of people talk about what it means in practical terms. Well, this is one of the ways that you can manage change. You manage change from within, essentially. You can't control what a lot of other people do. You can motivate people to some degree, but motivation depends on a lot of different factors, not the least of which is maybe your position in an organization. And I found that that's very important to understand, because you can have the best intentions, you can have the most noble approach and goals and mission statements, and you can even communicate that effectively to other people. But if they don't recognize or respect those values, if they don't even respect you and recognize the value of what you bring, you're going to not be able to affect much motivation. And this is one of the important elements of the Shinsei method and why I developed it as a method of self-training, self-development, self-analysis, ultimately. Because what I've found is that you hear, and a lot of people talk about a lot of these important concepts, but they don't talk about what they mean, and they certainly don't talk about how you apply them and then how you evaluate the results for your own individual situation. One of the first steps of the Shinsei method is to analyze your key terms. What is teamwork? Define those terms in an individually suitable way. In other words, you can understand what teamwork means to you, but how do you apply that in a way that's going to be of benefit to you? And when I talk about benefit, I often talk about profit and profitability. I understand profit and profitability to mean much more than just the financial profit, although that's important, but it's really what's of value, what's of benefit. That's also, most importantly, what's of profit and profitability to you. So when you're thinking about that, how it applies to you in an individual way, then you can really start to act on that new discovery, that new analysis, that new management of change, and then act on those terms and reevaluate that. Repeat. That really becomes the process of training. That becomes the process of self-development. Most importantly, it becomes the process of you. And that's an approach that many people don't take when they're talking about and thinking about things like teamwork. Most of the time, you'll hear things like, take one for the team, lead by example, set the best example, lead from the front. A lot of these kinds of things sound great, and they have a lot of insight to them because they are important. But what I found in most practical situations, again, unless you have the authority, people recognize your authority. Maybe you're in a position in an organization or in a family, and the family structure is such that the people recognize your authority. And authority doesn't mean the ability to instill fear in other people. Unfortunately, that's what people often understand authority, leadership to mean. Your ability to be able to instill fear and motivate people through fear. Now that's quite common. As much as people say that it isn't, it really is. And I have found from a very young age that really characterizes a lot of the social environments. So then you come along, let's say you're practicing the Shinsei method, and you believe in the concepts that I promote on this show and at theshinseimethod.com. And you come along to your work setting, your family setting, your school setting, and you try to apply these principles. You think about, what does teamwork actually mean? In other words, you are going to bring to a group of people, at least two, but maybe more, you're going to bring to a group of people your competitive advantage, what you can do well. And you're going to offer that as a value to the team. Now, is the value of the other team members going to respect that contribution? That's a question you have to answer for yourself. I have found very often they won't. And then it becomes a very difficult situation, because then what do you do in that case? You want to bring to a team a certain advantage. Let's say, for example, you live in a household, as I've often done, and security and safety are important to you, as they are to me. And you're a father, as I've been, or a husband, as I have been. And you bring to that very small team unit this value of safety and security. You say, you want to make sure that all the windows are closed, all the doors are locked, and you want to be sure that that gets practiced on a regular basis. Maybe you check your mail on a regular basis so that it doesn't stay in a mailbox or in a less secure environment, because obviously if you're receiving mail, a lot of times you have personal data. People often talk about the prevalence, and it is the prevalence of identity theft. Well, one of the ways that people have to steal your identity is through your mail. You have all your personal information, and it really doesn't take that much to check that on a regular basis. And I have lived in places where I have seen people do this. And I have communicated that I've seen people do this to other people that I've been living with. And the attitude of the people that I've been living with, the people around me, the people I've known, has been really, as I would describe it in a very a kind way, in a way, is just apathy, indifference. They're not interested. They don't practice it. It's not important. They don't check the windows, check the doors, etc. So then this is the reality that I have found in a very practical way that I have experienced personally. I've experienced similar things at the work environment. I've talked about in other segments of the show where it was important to me in every job that I've ever had to implement a concept of customer service that understood that customer service equals sales, sales equals customer service. Because when I understood it, and my philosophy of thinking was that if you are looking to sell an item, that sales is not just a final result. It's a process where you're engaging with people to really be able to communicate the value of your product and service to that person over a period of time. So that means communication then becomes important. That means a certain understanding about the customer is important. So that means a certain level of empathy is important in that interaction. And this is not just something you do for the sales only. This is the approach that you have on a regular basis. Because then when you have it as an approach that you implement on a regular basis, it becomes second nature. And we often talk about second nature. I've talked about kata in other segments of the show. Kata, very quickly, just simply means technique. It's derived from a body of knowledge called Bushido. Do means way, Bushi were the samurai. So it was a practice that they had to develop their warrior capabilities from within so that they would be better warriors from without. It's a very important concept to develop yourself from within. And this idea of kata is very important because it is what you do on a regular basis that allows you to develop a level of expertise. That's the key. So if you are taking an approach in sales, this approach to sales based on, let's say, kata, technique, practice, training, and you're taking that approach on a regular basis where you're engaging and interacting with customers so that you can communicate the value of your product and service to that person on a regular basis, to whomever you speak, then that becomes a second nature. It becomes what we call in Bushido Mushin or Makoto. Also, sometimes I've talked about Zanshin or Shugyo. It's a level of expertise. We also in the West call it intuition, second nature, where you are not thinking about doing a sale. You are engaging in the sale and everything that you do. It becomes who you are. It becomes what you do as an individual and as a sales professional. That's the approach that I take. That's the approach that's important for the Shinsei method. And it's an approach that you can take in every aspect of business and life. And that's an approach that I took even before I developed the Shinsei method, where sales equals customer service equals sales. In other words, you sell a product, that the sale doesn't end there. The sale continues where you will service that product. You will service the customer over a period of time, and many businesses understand that. But unfortunately, what happens is, particularly in sales, people just take the approach that I'm going to make a sale. Once the sale is over, I don't care. And if the customer shows he is not interested, I don't care. So it then becomes a very superficial approach to sales. But the reason I wanted to highlight sales in this segment of the show is to come back to teamwork. Because the ultimate example of a team is two people. When you're talking about teamwork, that applies in sales. If you're working with a customer, you're engaging in teamwork. You're making a contribution to that team. If you're in a family and you're a father or a mother or a sibling, you're contributing to that team. The question is, do the other members of that team recognize the value that you're bringing? Well, that really depends on them. But what I found is, now putting aside for a second the example of sales, because that's a little different. A customer is not really a full-fledged partner in a sense, because they're looking for value in your product and service, and they're not really bringing something to a team insofar as they're going to make a contribution other than what they pay you for their product if they buy it. So putting that to the side, it is teamwork, but from a different perspective. Let's think about teamwork from the perspective of people that are engaged in a group activity, a community, a family, a work department, or a department at the office. These are what we understand usually when we think about team. But what happens is, I've found in many social settings, is that if you have this idea of team, if you understand that teamwork means bringing your competitive advantage to the team to make a positive contribution to the team, and everybody else is doing likewise, and then you are engaging in that activity to produce a better result. And everybody understands what a better result means: a more efficient result, a more effective result, a more durable result, a more understandable result. This is what we mean by better when we think about better in very practical terms. And again, understand that's what the Shinsei method is all about. Understanding your key terms and thinking about what those terms mean for you in a very understandable way, but also in a very practical way. And this is important to do, because then when you are taking an approach where you're seeking to understand what you are doing and what you mean by these fundamental concepts like teamwork, then you can really affect some kind of change. You can manage the change that you affect in a more direct way, because you understand what you're doing. You can make adjustments, you can make alterations, and then evaluate what those results are, because you have a clear definition. It's rather like map reading. That's why I like to go back to some of those fundamental principles and concepts like map reading. Sometimes I often go back to investing. I don't offer investment advice, but I do talk about the principles of investing because they're very useful and insightful. And it's very similar. When you're map reading, you're looking at a map to find out something about the area where you want to go, and you want to be able to refer back to that map. Of course, you have to know how to read it, but you want to refer back to that map so that you have some idea of where you're going. You get lost, you can refer back to that map. That's understanding, that's enlightenment, that is clarity, going back to that map to evaluate what happened, what went wrong, so to speak, in that case. Doing the same thing in teamwork, doing the same thing at the workplace, doing the same thing in everyday life. But the thing that I have found that most people do not do is to think about what those terms mean in practical terms. What is teamwork, and why is that important? Well, that's important to you because if you're following this approach that I'm advocating on this segment of the show, and that I always advocate on every segment, again, that you can find at the shinseimethod.com or the Shinsei Method YouTube channel. If you're taking the approach of the Shinsei method, it's a very rational approach, it's a very practical approach, it's a very clear-minded approach. It's not going to be very common in many social settings. So you need a level of self-trust, inner balance, inner strength to help you guide through that discouragement, because it is discouraging. If you are taking the approach of teamwork, and many people won't dispute this definition that I've given of teamwork, they'll nod their head in agreement, and then they'll proceed to never live up to it. This is what I found in most social settings. People will say, yeah, that's important, that's important, that's important. And then when it comes time to make that positive contribution, they don't. Now, this applies in a very simple example of the very simplest team is a marriage. If you are engaged in a marital relationship, it's a partnership, it's a team. So that means that the people would bring to that team the competitive advantage that they have, the competitive value that they have, and seek to do that. Now, what I've found, and I've been married twice, what I've found is that I have taken that approach, but the other side didn't. So it causes a real difficulty. It causes a real challenge. Because again, they'll nod the head, the other side will nod the head, and then proceed not to live up to that idea of teamwork. That's a problem in itself. Because if you are thinking about teamwork, teamwork applies, let's say, to a contractual agreement. When you agree in contract, either a verbal agreement, a tacit agreement, and of course, one of the simplest contractual agreement is a sales arrangement between a customer and a business, because it's assumed from the perspective of the customer that the business is somewhat of an expert, at least in what they're doing, and that they're going to be able to offer a value to the customer that the customer doesn't currently enjoy. Otherwise, there's no purpose for the business. There's no purpose for the sale, and the customer is not in the market, either currently or in the future. So that's the simplest example of a team, but it's also the simplest example of a contractual agreement, whether it's written or not. It's understood, and one of the difficulties that people have, particularly in terms of conflict management and conflict resolution, is that they approach situations like that without this idea of a contract, understanding that they are bringing something to that arrangement. People have certain expectations. So one of the surest ways to reduce the level of conflict is to clarify the level of expectations. So clarification and clarity then becomes an important principle. What I found is that many people don't do that. That's one of the signs of teamwork, for example, bringing your competitive advantage. Do you recognize that clarity is important, so you want to try to clarify things a little bit better? Now, what you'll find is that in many social settings, it doesn't have an effect. It certainly won't have the desired effect. People aren't participating. They're not bringing their competitive advantage. A lot of times what they're doing is tearing down your competitive advantage. That's very discouraging. So one of the reasons that I developed the Shinsei method is to counter that to some degree, so that you are not in a position where you are doubting this approach to teamwork, to understanding, to clarity, to contracts, to cooperation. When you're understanding all of this spirit of teamwork, all of the spirit of teamwork that is indicated in all of those areas, cooperation, understanding, contracts, etc. And you're not doubting the value of those concepts because you're getting so much discouragement and in some cases demoralization by the people that you're engaged with. Many social settings, at work, at home, at school, at the office, etc. So that's why I found that self-trust, inner strength, and a balance was so crucial, because once you have a level of self-trust, when you can say to yourself, honestly, I recognize that teamwork is important. I understand what teamwork means. It means bringing my competitive advantage to a team and to a group. But I also understand the flip side of that, the balance side, the fairness part of the equation, that other people in the team also have to bring their competitive advantage, and most importantly, they have to want to bring their competitive advantage. That's what I found that a lot of people don't do. They will say they do, but ultimately it comes down to their actions, and if their actions don't demonstrate that it's important, they won't do it. So you have to judge the actions. And if you're in social settings where you're bringing in value and other people are not, then you have to reevaluate that arrangement. Sometimes you're in a position to do something about it. Sometimes you're not. So then you have to evaluate how much of a value will you actually bring. You have to evaluate what you can do, because from that perspective, you have complete control. You don't have a lot of control over what other people do. They're going to be motivated or they're not. You can try to motivate them and persuade them to the extent that you can provide the facts to them, you can provide certain insights to them, but ultimately people have to be motivated from within to take that initial action. I mean, because you can't force people, nor should you want to force people, nor want to motivate people through intimidation or fear. That really is not what we're talking about and not what the Shinsei method is all about. And it's really against my basic philosophy. So I'm not talking about that in this show, and I never will talk about it on any segments of the show here or at the shinseimethod.com or at the Shinsei Method YouTube channel, because ultimately we're talking about motivation from a positive position. And when you're talking about motivation from a positive position, you're understanding that people have free will. And it's really that free will that you are motivating to some degree or another. But ultimately, people have the choice to make their own decisions and take their own actions. That if they don't, so you have to evaluate that situation, that individual situation, based on what it is at the moment. And that's one of the differences with the Shinsei method, what I like to call the Shinsei advantage or the Shinsei difference, is that I recognize that things are not always perfect. And you don't always have a lot of control over what other people do, but you do have the ultimate control over what you do. Sometimes it's very difficult to do that. Sometimes it's very difficult to exercise a level of self-discipline, particularly when you don't get a lot of self or social support to do it. You don't get advancements, promotions, a lot of times compensation based upon your ability to discipline yourself, even though discipline and self-discipline is crucial. I often like to go back to things like physical fitness, and you can see more information about that with the Shinsei Fitness YouTube channel, where I talk about fitness, because with fitness, when you are talking about fitness and exercising control over what you do, you can see the benefits of self-discipline through fitness. Because if you discipline yourself to exercise, you'll see the results. It won't come instantaneously, but it's relatively quick. It's usually within a few months, and not certainly within your lifetime. Other things sometimes take longer. Building up wealth takes a longer period of time, usually, unless you're very lucky. So with fitness, it's a little more direct, and you have a little more control, direct control, to see the results more immediately, to use it as an example of validation for yourself, that self-discipline is very crucial. Another example that I've had recently is like a cholesterol level. Looking at your cholesterol level, or whatever level. I mean, you can take whatever level you want, but from a health perspective, now I'm not a health practitioner, I'm not a doctor, I don't offer medical advice, but I'm just an everyday person that has had to address cholesterol like a lot of people do. Now, I eat well, I try to maintain a certain nutritional level, maintain weight, exercise on a regular basis, have done since I was 13, many decades. But the cholesterol was slightly elevated recently. So I followed certain prescriptions, of course, of my personal physician, but also my own common sense and other information and research that I was able to glean to alter my nutritional level. And then took a test, and the cholesterol was lowered. But that's an example of seeking I use that personal example to highlight. This is what I have found is the way to build up self-trust. To find those kinds of things like a cholesterol test or whatever the test is, fitness, to be able to implement certain changes in what you do in your nutrition, in your exercise regimen, and your viewpoints, your views, your values, and then to evaluate the changes in your actions over a period of time, to seek validation for yourself that this is the appropriate course of action for you. That's the way. It's a slow-going way sometimes to build up self-trust, but it's very valid and valuable for you, because if you have self-trust, it becomes much easier then to implement things in your life, in your business, in your workplace, in your school setting, in your family, in a way that is going to be productive for yourself, regardless of what other people are doing. Because a lot of times, even when you're talking about things like teamwork, and they're saying, yes, 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 teamwork is so important, and then you see through their actions that they're not demonstrating that it is, you can still maintain the course. You often hear people talk about maintaining the course. Well, this is one of the ways I found, one of the most practical ways and durable ways I found to do it. Because just to say to yourself to maintain the course is not enough. You have to believe in the course. And if you don't believe in the course because you've gone through that process of thinking in your own life and you have seen the results, like with the cholesterol test or whatever the test, the health test, the fitness, you have validated it for yourself. If you haven't done that, then it becomes very difficult to then maintain the course under the barrage of social pressure on you not to do it, because that's often what happens. If you take the approach, like I said, customer service equals sales, sales equals customer service. I took that approach. At one of my previous jobs, went to the extent of printing it out and putting it up on the cubicle. No one ever noticed it. It was never even a point of discussion, even for management. They don't even notice those kinds of things, and they don't say anything about it. Now that's a very unique thing to do at your workplace, but from a social situation, you don't get a lot of support for it. So it becomes very difficult, and very easy, I should say, to then say things like that: sales equals customer service equals sales. This practicing of teamwork by striving toward value and bringing your value to a team and making sure that, at least from your perspective or what you can control, that other people are doing the same and doing likewise. And then if they're not to throw away completely this idea of teamwork and value, but continue to maintain it in your life as an important concept and practice it from your perspective. To maintain that, despite what is going on in the environment, then becomes that important to have that level of self-trust and a strength and a balance. And that's what I found so crucial to do, because if you don't develop it for yourself, it really is very difficult to develop, of course. No one else is going to develop it. And then you'll have, in many social settings, the discouragement that seems to go along with a lot of social settings in practicing that kind of conscientious philosophy in your life, in your work, in your business, and in your family. Until the next time on the Derek Evans Show, where we talk about the Shinsei method and other topics relevant to you, to your business, to your work, to your family, to your life.